But I want to have video.
Yep. Start video. Start video camera.
Abroad.
And then
I'm
settings.
but I do get to have there's some two cool parts. So like the Celtics are going to be playing London in
The settings. Where's the
I'm
settings?
just on a meeting with them today.
I'll just
hash out the specifics and stuff. So
Good luck.
yeah.
Where I'm actually caught by both cameras. So I'll be standing here for the next 3 hours. Can we just go around the room? I have sort of a list of students, but I haven't broken it. Don't have it broken down by in class and online. Can we just go around quickly, say your name? I understand you're all second years in this program. So.
Hi, my name is Ziyu Hui.
Okay.
My name is
Tasha Nassim.
Okay.
Su Zhangxiao,
I'm currently
Okay.
Yan Su.
Okay. And I'm Christian. I'll say a little bit more. About me right now, because I've not been in this program. This is my first time teaching in this program. I've actually been taught in the Masters of International Relations when I first came here, but I've been mainly engaged in our PhD in public policy. I'm an economist by training. I got my PhD from UMass Amherst almost, exactly 20 years ago. God, I'm old. I've been a professor in the Department of Public Policy and Public Affairs for a decade now. I didn't think I would last as long. Before coming to UMass, I was working for the typical American institution for think tanks in Washington, D.C. I've been affiliated and worked with 4 different think tanks in Washington, D.C. I'm still a senior fellow with the Center for American Progress. I'm a research associate at the Economic Policy Institute. I'll say something about that in a second. When I started my career, most of my research was on international finance. So my dissertation actually looked at the role of foreign banks in Poland and Hungary after the Iron Curtain. I looked at particularly the supply of credit. So what does the presence of foreign banks do to the supply of credit by domestic banks, and who gets shut out, who gets access to credit? In my first job at the Economic Policy Institute as a research economist, I did a fair amount of international work. I looked largely at things like my first job, my research looked at labor rights, labor standards in countries around the world. During globalization, during increased globalization, things like we looked at Brazil, South Africa, we did some work with some colleagues there, and then when I moved to become senior economist for the Center for American Progress, which is a large left-leaning think tank in Washington, D.C., I did a fair amount of international work, largely international trade, and I also had to learn quickly a lot about tax policy, so right for tax policy. I did some budget stuff. My main research is on retirement issues, so Social Security, healthcare, which is the biggest psychedelics, at least in the United States, that I focus a lot of my research on. And what else do I need to say? Nowadays, I work largely on US issues, primarily in retirement income security, social security, retirement savings, the challenges of the aging population, the pressure it puts on taxes and budgets, and I work on wealth inequality, especially the gap in by race, gender, and a few other dimensions. Yes?
So what made you switch from international to more domestic?
My employers, the people who pay the bills. A few things. I was working in think tanks that had sort of some interest in international issues. And initially, when the economic policies hired me, they had a big grant to fund that work for a number of years. The funder, we shall go unnamed here, changed their mind. They wanted more domestic work. I should also say that while I really like the international work, especially since it got me to travel around the world, I had started researching things like retirement and social security towards the end of my grad school career. So the side business came just simply like being in Washington, retirement issues just became so much more important than tax issues. I started in Washington. My first job was 1997. And then I did economic policy institute. I started in 1999. So I did some international work. But by 2001, we had, I'm probably a lot older than all of you, and you probably don't remember. If you follow the US, I assume not all of you are from the US. But we had a big discussion starting in 1998, 2001, and 2005, massively changing Social Security. And so I had to learn a lot about that very quickly. And it was just growing interest from key audiences, unions. I do give a lot of talks to a very wide variety of audiences. I talk to academics, I talk to students, obviously, but I also give talks to financial service companies, big mutual funds, pension plans, insurance companies, that kind of thing I do regularly. And then I give some talks to unions and to nonprofits and others on occasion. Last year did a book tour and that was a bunch of talks, but and they're just simply asking for time. It's just taking up more of my time. I'm currently engaging more in trade policy, largely because it's something that President Trump is pushing, sort of has revived that debate what trade policy in the US should look like. But at the same time, we had healthcare debate, I was engaged in that. I did write a few pieces on that. Retirement right now is on the back burner, is an issue for the United States. It's always there. People worry about it, both from a policy, from a budgetary perspective. People, the citizenry, worries about their retirement. But the other part is also right now we have a big tax debate. Cutting taxes, reforming taxes, corporate taxes, which that look like in the United States. So that requires everybody to engage. And trade, I think, will be sort of an issue. How can we make sure that workers share fairly in the gains of trade? How do we set trade policy? In our program here in the Public Policy PhD program, I teach microeconomics, introduction to microeconomics, and I teach in the second semester public finance. That's sort of the theory of optimal taxation, theories of how efficient spending, and so on. It's a little bit less applied than what we're doing. And finally, we have noticed I have a slight accent. I'm not American. Well, I am an American citizen. I'm not originally from the US. I am German. I came here 27 years ago. And my wife is American. So that's just to say that I do have some relevant experience. I am an economist and not a public administration person. So you will get everything that was promised to you in the syllabus and the abstracts and everything, but the way the course is designed, the way I have designed, I'm going to give you sort of a heavy dose of economics, basic economics. What's economic growth? What are some drivers of economic growth? How can budgets help or hinder economic growth? How does economic growth interact with the budget? Poverty alleviation, how do we measure poverty? How do we define income inequality? What do budgets do? Those kinds of things. I will emphasize real-world examples as much as I can. My experience, my international experience is a little dated, so if I get something wrong about a country, feel free to correct me. I will look up numbers before we come to class as much as I can. I'm obviously fairly current on US examples, so I will bring them in, but I try not to be too US centric. I'll say something about that in a second. I will emphasize public policy, so my sort of secret sauce or my specialty is that I'm not just a theoretical and applied economist, but I have a fair amount of experience in the public policy world. So I will bring in the politics and sort of how the sausage is made when it comes to public policy, how a budget actually gets negotiated, and who has weighs in, that kind of stuff. While we will look at budgets, and if you read the sort of first chapters of one of the textbooks, you see the economy does and markets and will play a key role. One of the things you have to remember, what we see these days around the world when it comes to budgets through an economic lens and designing budgets and making budgets work for the citizenry, a lot of that is driven by economic thinking. Performance measures and other things are sort of defining outcomes are driven sort of by the thinking that we should be efficient. That is, we should put the money to the best use in terms of creating happiness, utilitarianism. That is, this neoclassical thinking is a fairly, how should I say, it's a normative framework. And you will consider that and look at that critically, that it is not just simply how do we get the biggest bang for the buck in every program, but there's some programs that we know from the beginning won't give us a lot of immediate bang. Early childhood education, the payoff for early childhood education comes 20 years down the road. How do we measure the performance? How do we address things like aging society, right? There is no efficiency measure when it comes to letting people age and ultimately die with dignity, right? So we have to be critical of some of these bringing too much economic thinking, because the dominant paradigm when it comes to economic thinking around the world is standard neoclassical economics. It's still so we're critical voices now coming online, but that tends to be sort of the dominant paradigm. So if there is some sort of market force or market parallel in your budget, it says we should treat our budgets on the revenue and the spending side just like a business would treat their budgets. You automatically enter a normative framework that puts efficiency over and above other things like equity and sustainability and other things. So while we will accept that for the time being, we should also normally critically analyze it and consider what would an alternative like. Okay. Before I go on, can you briefly tell me again your names and then before we go on, before you give me your names and tell me, also I forgot to say it will take me a while to learn your names. Tell me also which countries you're from, US and somewhere else. I've already outed myself as being associated with think tanks. You can look up these think tanks. They're very left-leaning by US standards. That's not I don't make this a secret. I will try to keep my politics out of this. It does influence some of my thinking, but I'm happy to engage on any challenges on this. I don't impose my politics of it, and I think I'm pretty easy at bringing in sort of balance view. Okay? But if you feel I don't, you should say so. Why don't we go around again? Can you say your name again and tell me where you're from?
My name is Ziyun Hui. I come from China, and I'm an exchange student.
Okay.
And I think this is my first time to learn about the body scale.
Okay, good.
And my name is Pan Shi. I come from China too.
Okay.
That's all. Thank you.
My name is Taz Hussein. An easy way to remember that is my nickname is Taz. So the Tasmanian Devil.
Okay.
So
I
just
have another colleague who's
Really?
Yeah, his name is
That's-
Taz Wilburns.
That's awesome. It's such like a rare name because it's as a nickname, so that's actually really interesting to hear. But I'm born in the United States. I'm actually from New Orleans. My parents are from Bangladesh, both of them, so ethnically I'm from Bengali. And yeah,
Okay, New Orleans, that's a long way out.
yeah, it is.
Well, not as long as China.
Exactly.
You're all from China. All right.
I'm from Taz. My name is Su Xiao. I'm from Beijing, China, and you can call me Violet if that's too hard for you because my name is too long. And
Okay, Violet.
Violet,
Okay,
yes,
I'll try to practice.
yeah, it's too hard for Violet to pronounce it.
My name is Karanti, and you can please call me Lee. And this is the second year of our program.
Okay.
So,
Who here has taken budget class before in the program? So you're the only one who's done some budget? No.
I used to get my bachelor degrees from business administration program. So we learned something.
Okay. Yeah. But, so that's the thinking that we'll have to like rejigger that thinking a little bit when it comes to governance. Oh,
Yeah, I'm Yan. Yan Sun. Just call me Yan. And there is a similar name in America. Maybe the same pronunciation, similar pronunciation. So Yan is
Yeah.
very hard to pronounce.
okay. I wanted, okay, I'm going to ask the names again. And I'll go home and get this and try to memorize it. And finally, what I didn't get to do today was I didn't get to print out the, what's it called? The blackboard, the visor. I didn't print out the syllabus. I changed it, and I ran out of printer toner. And if you have access to this blackboard, you can find it there. I just updated it, and I'll say something about that in a second. So all class materials are related are available on Blackboard. That is, I'll go through some of these materials in a second. If you have trouble finding something, things don't download properly. When you download them, they don't open up properly. There's gibberish. I tried to make them all PDFs. There's a bunch of videos. If they don't load, shoot me an email. My email is christian.reller@umb.edu. And I'll usually respond in less than 24 hours and we'll fix it. It's important that you have access to all of the materials online. The class runs from 5:30 to 8. I understand that that's a little earlier than other classes. It has to do with me having to take catch-up training. And I apologize, this was the official time, and so I went with that. So it wasn't an issue today. Please be sure to be on time. Given that everybody here was on time or before time, and given that I have to rush out of class, if you have questions, you want to discuss things, you can set up a time with me to meet in my office early in the afternoon. We can do this on the phone, but I'm also available. I'll try to be here around 5 to set things up, so just come here and talk. Not an issue. It usually asks students to be done with snacks and eating before coming to class. It has turned out to be too disruptive to do this during class. Please turn off all cell phones for the class. Using computers, tablets, taping me with the voice recorder is totally fine. I have no objections to that. But you'll have access to the video. So yes.
That problem. Do you mind me use a cell phone to check English word? I can.
Oh yeah.
I can transfer my
But when I say cell phone, turn cell phone off, don't turn it off. I mean turn it off.
I can.
Yeah. I don't. Please don't play Angry Birds. But,
Angry Birds is a little outdated.
they just sold the company for over $1 billion.
Yeah,
And
okay.
my son is addicted to it. Don't.
That's like not indicative of like an app's performance. I mean, Snapchat when it went public in school, like how much, and it's a dying medium. So.
Is it Angry Birds? Like,
No,
I'm not going to tell my 6-year-old son that.
Okay, maybe it's for like younger audiences now, but I'm just saying.
I
Like,
find
once
it-
you hit high school and up, it's no longer a thing.
All right, I love Angry Birds. My son and I played. And it drives me nuts if I can't kill all the two.
I do have to say I did watch the movie and I did like the movie. So
Sorry?
there's an Angry Birds movie,
It sounds. My son has watched it on Netflix. It's absolutely awful.
but it's actually good.
It is good.
It is. I'll
All right.
vouch for it.
All right, I'll check. Yeah, so when I say turn off your cell phones, just turn off the non-vibrate, just put it on silent. Obviously, it's fine. As I said, don't take these. The lecture is also taped here on Echo. I hope that will work. And maybe if this Zoom thing works, you can have 2 different versions where you can see yourself. If you want to be in the public life, I assume you do if you're public administration. Unfortunately, these days, you have to get used to seeing yourself on camera. I know it's painful at first. You're laughing. It's painful. I know. Like, I got media training on my first few jobs in Washington. I had to watch myself making mistakes and stumble and having sort of everybody criticize you for saying silly things. You get used to it, and the more you get used to it, the more you also appreciate how much you can learn about your own presentation, keeping things short, keeping things which are not good in class. How about class? When I have to, I can get some. So maybe that's a learning experience. But if it works and you don't feel comfortable, you should feel free to sit outside of the screen area. I appreciate that you were willing to give it a try today. I won't post the video until I get the go ahead for today. And now let me just say a few things about this class format. This is, as you know, an on-campus, online hybrid class that presents a few challenges for the online students, which I try to address. I want to give both groups of students the same learning experience. What that means is all students have access to the taped Echo video, so you can see that on Blackboard. And once I clear that the Zoom quality is actually decent, and we can post it. You have a second video. I will make these class notes available so you can see. And I typically stick pretty closely, not verbatim to these, but you sort of get the rundown and ask discussion questions on it. I've already taped a few short introductory videos. So there's one, a welcome message, there's one for today. I just posted one this afternoon that's in assignments, and I'll say something about that in a second. What I will repeat what's on there, but so you have a 5-minute video there. These videos are just intros, they don't replace the lecture. We're obviously going to go a lot more detail here than just a quick 5 minutes, 10 minutes. We will have weekly discussion boards. They are part of the assignments and participation in that. The sort of on the syllabus, this does describe what I expect from that. I've added a few web links on the home page. There's sort of a tab that says web links, and I've added a link These are links to key institutions. I'll say something when it comes to assignments, and then there's a tab called tip sheets, and I'll say something. I should say that participation is not part of your student grade. We want to have discussions, encourage discussions, but I'm not going to grade that. I think that's silly. You want to encourage, you want to participate, you can ask questions. I really welcome that, we want that, but I'm not going to say, well, we didn't say enough in class. Because there's lectures and it all works, there's going to be 2 different versions of the video feeds, because there's intro videos, because there's discussion boards, and because as class notes, I will use PowerPoint very sparingly. I have an aversion to PowerPoint presentations. Largely, for an evening like tonight, I mean, I looked at this, there really wasn't anything where I could design a PowerPoint slide that would somehow enhance what I have to take. I mean, I can sort of have PowerPoints where all this text that's in the class notes is on PowerPoints, and then you read the screens while I'm talking. You miss either what's on the screens, or you miss what I'm saying. It's sort of too distracting. So given that I'm giving you the class notes, I will use sometimes the PowerPoint if I find a nice data graphic or something like that that I think is worth highlighting, and I will show that to you. But I don't have a real aversion to have a lot of text that students have to read while I'm talking to PowerPoint. So I'm not going to change it too often. I've come to this realization after many, many years of actually having presentations where students just read along and things get lost. So, as I said, the class notes, what I'm holding in my hand, will be on Blackboard. Bottom line is that I will try to do this. Oh, I do not expect attendance is also not part of it. So if you need to miss the class, and you want to give me the courtesy and say, like, I'm not going to be in class because I'm sick, I have to go somewhere or go to a conference, that's fine. I'm not going to grade you on attendance. I think you get a better experience from a group discussion here than some of you, like you get a different experience than from the online experience, and presumably you've chosen the on-campus experience for a reason, but I want to treat you all as adults, so attendance is not something. Now, there will be weekly discussion boards, and I need to figure out how to get them started. I haven't started the first one. I'll do that the first one tomorrow. On the syllabus, it says what the requirements is. Everybody has to sort of weigh in with one post at least, and answer basic questions that I will post. This counts for 20% of the total course grade. You will need to write one outside reading summary and discussion. Again, the details are listed on the syllabus. This writing is another 20% of your course grade, and each student will give a country presentation. I've already sent around the presentation assignments, but if you open the syllabus today, you will see that I changed the order of the presentations. That has the largest effect for whoever is assigned to Canada. Who is Gian? That's you. So rather than presenting Canada in week 10, Canada is coming up in week 5. If that's too soon, would you like to go later in the semester? I can offer you presentation on Brazil in week 12. Or do you want to stick with Canada and do week 5? You're going to stick with Canada? Okay, Canada. All right. The other one that I moved also earlier, I believe, is was another one. I think the United Kingdom, but that moved up by like 1 or 2 weeks. And that's not somebody who's in the country. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, I just had a really quick question about these presentations. I know that I was switched from Brazil to Pakistan, but I was wondering if it was okay with you if I reached out to the person who does hold the presentation of the UK. I currently am working for the British Consulate General, so I'm working directly with Brexit policy. So I feel like it would be more up my alley.
Okay, that's fine with me.
Thank you.
You can contact them directly. Do you have the email?
Yeah, I have the email.
All right, that's fine. Now, given that, and then there's a final exam, it's a take-home exam that's worth 40%. And then there's 2 TBDs on here, Brazil and Thailand. My initial note I got from Kate Riley was that there were 15 people in the class. Turns out there's only 13 people. So I will deal with the presentations, Thailand and Brazil, as with the other countries that are not assigned. Now, there's 2, as I said, on the main website. There's a tab that says web links, and then there is one that says tip sheets. Let me say something about the web links. The web links, the way they're organized, and I will try to group them a little bit more. The first sort of web links, first of all, I've always added a little bit of context to each of them, saying like this is what this organization is or what they do. The first ones are sort of official or quasi-official ones, such as IMF, World Bank, Asian Development Bank, Inter-American Development Bank, OECD, and so on and so forth. Then it goes into sort of like private entities. I will add a few data links, in particular the World Income, the World Database of Income and Wealth. That's Emmanuel Sias and his colleagues at Berkeley. The Luxembourg Income Study, which is sort of international wealth comparisons. Those are the 2 ones. Obviously, OECD, United Nations, and IMF have all various data, especially the United Nations, UNDESA, the Department of Economic and Social Affairs. They're the ones responsible for creating national accounts, including government spending, government outlays, and taxes. I haven't looked at their website I actually did some consulting work right out of grad school, but I haven't looked at their website in years. Some of this data was available for purchase. It might at this point be available for free. But they also do publish a print version, which you can find at the library, typically, of the national accounts. And gives you sort of the standard accounting methods, GDP, government spending, taxes, central government versus local governments, that kind of stuff. So if you ever want to do some comparative research, that's not a bad resource. Other resources are obviously behind that for the World Bank. They don't do it quite systematically because they typically do it only for the countries where they, for instance, set structural adjustment programs and stuff like that in place. But those are not bad sources either, especially the international financial statistics. Again, they tend to be available for purchase. The library should have them. If our library doesn't have it, maybe another library has them. The other websites I listed there tend to be think tanks, especially American ones, but I added at least one British one, Institute of Bristol Studies. With that, I should say I apologize that the list at this point is US and European centric. To some degree, that is a necessity out of driven. Many of these international organizations, the Bretton Woods organizations, are located in the United States. Some of them, there is a lot of UN organizations that are not based in the US, but those for organizations like UNICEF that are a little bit less relevant for our purposes here. So the economic ones, budgetary ones, development ones tend to be in New York, in Washington. The other part is I do need to be mindful that this is an American university. English is our primary language, so the websites need to have easy links to an English translation. If a website doesn't have that, I can't figure out where the English translation for this is. Can't post it. It's just an accessible issue. If you have, as I said, and I will add it and I will group them a little bit more. I do not expect you to use any or all of them or any of them. These wetlands, they're just there for you. If you want to do research on your own, if you have questions, or for the various assignments, especially the presentations and the short country write-up, you might want to just glance and say, like, is there supplementary data to the readings you see that may give you a quick insight. The like income inequality in China, so seeing that with 5 students from China, you might want to look at that with money insights. And the Luxembourg income study should have something on China as well. The Luxembourg, it's called the Luxembourg income study, but it is really income in well. So that's on the web links. I will add web links to it, and I will try to group them a little bit more. But again, consider them a resource as you go through the assignments. If you want to just, and that's why I have sort of one sentence underneath each link. You don't have to click on the link to see whether this is something potentially useful for you. But you can just go down, scroll the list and say, okay, well, this looks like something useful. This doesn't, and just move on. The other sort of external tab to which I will not add is called tip sheets. Those tip sheets are things I've written over the last 10 years, just simply born out of necessity. I've noticed that students in our programs always have similar questions of how do I write for non-academic audiences. So there's one tip sheet on writing for policy audiences, but that's sort of probably a misnomer. It's writing for educated lay people, people who don't go through the program, but think about sort of you have to inform a governor, a mayor, their staff. They're interested in your subject matter, interested in how budget work, but they're not really experts. You're the experts. You're getting a master's. You're getting trained in this. How do you translate your expertise so that it's useful to somebody on the other side? Most importantly, everything important needs to be in the first paragraph. Most people want to be beyond this. I'm sorry to say that. It's an art. Obviously, there's always going to be somebody who will dig through all your endnotes and footnotes and references and tables that you have. So you need to have the other part. Whatever you say in the first page, the first paragraph needs to be backed up. But look at this, it's short, gives you some tips on how to write, or to organize your writing. I'm not a writing expert. I'm not going to give you lessons in English grammar, type of grammar. That's not my strength. But my strength is sort of like how to organize the writing. The second one there is a memo that I call professional presentations, and you should take it, whatever is useful from that, gives you sort of tips on how to overcome anxiety. Everybody has anxiety. Everybody has butterflies in their stomach before a big presentation. Everybody who comes into a classroom for the first time, secret, we all have butterflies before we come here. Let's just try to write these things out so I don't stumble when I see the group for the first time, right? So those things. So basic tips, practice and writing out notes and practicing and taping yourself, getting used to that kind of stuff. Then there's 2 other things that might be useful. One is called Thoughts on Writing Professional Reviews. That was really written a little bit more for PhD students and junior faculty. But I also had students like you in mind. The idea is you will regularly be asked in your professional lives to give feedback to somebody else's work. Somebody will show you a master's thesis, or if you go and work in budgeting in an financial organization, somebody says, here's a draft report. Can you give me your feedback? And really, what I want to accomplish with that tip sheet is just you being thoughtful reviewers of giving not this like this is uninteresting and this is stupid. Who can anybody ever say something like this? That's not particularly helpful. Like give your expertise. Say like I think it would be helpful to reorganize this, or it would be good to have this data point. here's a reference, here's a data point, here's something I can contribute, not just to be helpful, because if you're helpful to them, they will be helpful to you. Increasingly in our world of social science and public management, we have to work as teams. The world where we all sat in a little cubicle and did our own thing, that's 20 years outdated. This is collaborative efforts when it comes to public policy, public administration all around the world. And the more we learn to be good colleagues and productive and constructive colleagues and helpful colleagues to each other, the better the ultimate product will be. And then there is a final data sheet that says sort of data analysis. Again, it's a little bit of a data number. It's not data analysis. It's not sort of, it has a little bit of basic statistics in it. It's just simply like tips on how to put data into context. How do you establish comparison points between countries that are useful, that are meaningful? There's sort of some basic things that you may not have learned in statistics that I just have picked up over the years that I throw in there. Again, I don't expect you to read any or all of them, of these tip sheets. They're there in case you have questions of how do I write, how do I make the writing accessible for others. If you have questions about the presentation, I may not answer, like the tip sheets may not answer all of the questions you have about the presentation, so call me, shoot me an email. And I'll answer those questions. Now, yeah. The Blackboard site, I did not turn on my own clock. All right, 6:30, is that right? We'll take a break in a second. So the Blackboard site for our class includes a fair amount of material. There are 2 required texts. These 2. Sorry. Do you all have, that was not comment on the book. Do you all have the books? Do you have electronic copies of the books? Do you need to get the books?
I need to get the first one.
This one?
Yeah,
The
the second
menu?
one is on shipping.
Sorry?
Second one is on shipping.
Okay.
But the first one is a little bit expensive.
All right.
Yeah.
It is?
And $100.
At this point, there's nothing you can do about it. I'm sorry. I can't just copy it. Is there like if there's are there ebook versions of this? I thought this one had an ebook version. Really? Is this one?
This one is
cheap.
Yeah. It's only $20.
Right. Yeah, I apologize. The problem is I took over the syllabus from somebody else, and I need to support for a number of institutional reasons. Well, all the other materials are made available to you as PDFs or links and are freely available. So, but for the 2 textbooks, I'm sure you can be creative.
Yeah.
See it without telling me. I'm still so far. I'm done. I think today with week 2, and I will make that available to you with additional readings. Again, we're going to rely on, when it comes to Ghana and China, we're going to rely heavily on the textbooks. Ghana and China are previously. It's on the syllabus, and I haven't changed that. But there's additional readings available that I will make available. You just need to click the week 2 readings after putting some links. And in all of those, I want you to do readings, take notes, ask yourself questions. Importantly, are there some theoretical aspects? And we're going to talk some budget theory in a second. Are the relevant aspects, which aspects are considered or included, either explicitly or implicitly, which ones are not? Should there be something else? Is the empirical analysis well done? Does it include all the relevant data? Is the data presentation convincing, or is it just, are there obvious mistakes, or is there no source? Those kinds of things. Be critical users of data. And the big one, because it's a comparative class, do the conclusions that the chapter reads and that the reading apply to other cases? Or, equally important, do the conclusions suggest something for the future of a country? Is there sort of a forward-looking conclusion? It's not all that useful to say, like, well, that country, Luxembourg, got into a real mess over the last 20 years. Well, how are they getting out of it? If that's it. Luxembourg doesn't have a mess, I'm pretty sure. Most optional. Thank you. Okay? That kind of questions. Those would be critical questions to ask. Now, this class is on comparative public budgeting. We will look how governments around the world make decisions on revenue, which factors primarily determine those decisions. Largely, we're going to focus on the economy and the budget certainty, so the environment, how certain a budget, how likely are you to get the same revenue that you had last year? How likely is your spending going to stay within a reasonable range? Right? If you engage all of a sudden in a massive war, or a coup comes along and you live in a highly unstable political environment, the best laid budget plans are worth nothing because all of a sudden you have all of these things happening that require you to readjust your spending. Whether and how fast governments can change and possibly improve outcomes for their citizens. We will first start looking at budget models. Sort of how we think about what drives models, how can we predict outcomes of the budgeting process, how can we understand the gap between a budget that's enacted by a government and the one that's implemented. Right? Just because we're saying we're going to spend $1 billion on infrastructure, in the end, we'll only spend $500 million on it because we couldn't find the contractors, or we spent. Well, none of you are from Boston, so I'll give you the Boston example. Okay? The Big Dig. You know what the Big Dig is? Have you heard of the Big Dig? You all live in Boston? Who knows what the Big Dig was? Have you been downtown Boston? No? Have you been downtown Boston? Have you been on that little park?
It was a highway thing.
It was a highway thing, yeah. What's now called the Rose Fitzgerald Greenway. Right, that little park, that long park that runs through downtown Boston, that used to be a highway on stilts that ran through the town. Whereas now the tunnel, Williams Tunnel, doesn't exist. So the 1990s, Boston basically dug up the ground and put the big highway under it. It was supposed to be something like $4 billion and done in 6 years. It cost $10 billion in 10 years. Right? That's budget implementation gone horribly wrong. Right? Those kinds of things. What drives that? What are sort of the factors that drive this wedge between with the budget that you laid out, that you took money out for, that you raised taxes for, and the money that you're actually spending? So we'll do that. Now, let me say one more word before we go into the break. And that is one that I want to highlight over and over and over again. While we will talk about budgets, and while budgets, budgeting, and implementation of budgets is our primary focus, governments do not pursue budgets for their own sake. They're a means to an end. They are a tool to achieve societal goals, be that economic growth, be that poverty alleviation, be that sustainability and environmental protection, and a bunch of other things that we can think of what governments should do, and we'll discuss them. We have to keep that in mind, that while we're going to talk about how governments wield that tool and use that, in the end, the question is, what's the ultimate goal that a government has? What does the government want to do? We need to understand and be mindful that the goals of each country, of each society, will be different. It's grounded in their current living standards, in their own historical development, in their society, in their culture, their political culture, but also their societal values. And we need to be mindful of that as we compare countries. It's not helpful to say, well, France did that, and now Bangladesh should do it too. Well, maybe not. It's not clear that France and Bangladesh have all that much in common, right? And we need to be mindful and be thoughtful about what are the values, the norms of a country that determine their goals for their citizens. Obviously, also the institutional setups will matter. How much voice do citizens have in shaping budgets? So we will ask, are the budgets consistent with the stated goals and norms of a country? Sometimes they're not. Think of sort of Japan as sort of an example, right? Japan always struggles with, I don't think we have anybody from Japan in this class. Japan struggles with the fact that it needs to be a regional power. It needs to engage for its own protection, militarily, in foreign policy. But when it comes to budgets, and when it comes to spending, it sort of sometimes ramps up military spending, and sometimes tries to buy its way into good graces of partner countries, and then it pulls back. Those, like this sort of tension, it's understandable given Japan's history, right? And the same as, look at Germany. I'm from Germany. Germany needs to be, and everybody wants it to be, sort of a regional power, a leader, a mediator between Central and Eastern Europe on the one hand, on sort of the Western powers like the United Kingdom on the other hand. And often also a mediator in the Middle East conflict between the Palestinians and Israelis. And it has done sort of diplomatically done a reasonably good job on that. But when it comes to budgets, Germany is really reluctant to put a lot of money into these efforts, either be that foreign or sort of national security military. Germans, for odd reasons, are happy sending military hardware, but sort of engaging both in hard power and soft power and budgeting for that is certainly not something. Germany has moved in that direction since the Kosovo conflict, but very reluctantly, and I think to some degree the world also wants Germany to be re-elected hard power. I mean, but it is a tension, right? And we need to be mindful of that countries like Germany, Japan, and others need to play, especially now in this new world where the US is pulling back as sort of a power, where others have to step in. And others will step in. China is stepping in. But then others, I mean, China also has sort of tensions between how ambitious does it want to be, how much does it want to engage in potential conflicts with its neighbors, right? And what are its national allies and where are its international enemies? So it doesn't budget. Those are kind of foreign security is always, national security is always a clear government goal, but it does create tensions. All right. So, the internal logic of this class, the way we're going to proceed over the course of this class. We'll first discuss comparative budget frameworks. We'll touch on this today, maybe run over into next week. We will then next discuss over the coming weeks key economic measures. We're going to talk about taxable base, forms of taxation, forms of revenue. Then we're going to talk about economic growth, factors that determine economic growth, measures of poverty, measures of income inequality, how governments can affect poverty, inequality, how they have affected that. And then we're going to move relatively quickly, sort of in week 5, 6, after I think, after Canada, we're going to start moving into sort of the budget process, decentralization, and other things. That doesn't mean we're going to talk economics exclusively in the beginning and then budget processes. It's just a matter of emphasis. In the beginning, we're talking a little bit more about the economics of budgets so that we all have a common understanding. Where does the money come from? And what drives sort of the spending? What are some of the goals of government spending? And then we're going to look at, okay, well, how do governments decide where to raise money and how to spend? And decentralization and the linkages between different levels of government will be an overarching theme for that. Okay. With that, why don't we take a quick break? 5 minutes? And then we'll talk a little bit more. And then I'll let you talk too. Yeah.
I'm wondering if you change the sequence of the presentation right now, or because
What were you saying for?
yeah, because I sent you an email said that I wanted you to do the China, and the presentation sequence you put it online still that Jessica Washington is going to do the China.
No?
So yeah, so I thought, okay.
This should be the one online.
No, I just checked that. It's not
Okay.
the
All right.
one.
No.
Okay.
You're up for China.
Okay. So I will do next week.
Yes. Thank you.
Okay.
I'm sure you'll be fine.
Yeah, they're all from China, but
This is the latest. Yes.
Schedule. So there's no change from my copy. Section 7. In my office, week 1 is week 7.
Yeah. Okay. I figured you wouldn't mind moving it backwards.
No.
You're okay?
Okay.
You're still okay with Italy?
Totally.
Okay.
that'll be more fun.
Yeah.
Oh no. That will be the midterm one.
Yeah.
So it's
That'll
okay.
be a lot of
I will
things.
bring everything in
Yeah.
advance.
Yeah. I just changed the order on this sheet, but thank you for pointing this out. This is the master one I work off. I need to double check. PDF should actually be the same.
No, it's not the same right now.
But
So the material about the presentation is from, I haven't go through our whole textbook. So
it's the
material-
assigned for China. So here, there's a chapter on China, chapter 3.
Oh, I can find all the material from textbook.
In the textbook, and then there's 2 optional readings. I'll make them available. As I said tonight, they're already online. These other things I wanted to make available, but less relevant for you. Does China have a value-added tax?
Sorry.
What kind of tax?
A value-added tax?
Oh,
Yeah, of course.
Okay. I have one additional reading from the IMF on what the value-added tax is, and I have one more that I want to put on as optional readings on decentralization, the pros and cons of decentralization of budget processes. That's also what China is doing some decentralizing. Okay.
So, but this about China is.
Oh, China's first.
First.
Yeah, in Italy.
I also Chinese, but the
Yeah. Sorry. I will. You know what? The reason why I don't make all the classes, I have all the classes already online. I just haven't made them available because I'm still adding stuff and editing it. I'm trying to. You know what? I'm just going to make them all available right now. That way, you have them for the presentations, and all that will change is there may be a little bit more material, but there will be optional readings, and you don't have to read all of them.
Oh, I see. So, when we prepare for the presentation, we just need to read the material list on this.
Yeah, but not all. The optional readings there will be more and more optional readings. And they're really optional readings. But again, like if you look at, so there's this IMF report that I want to put on there that sort of has a quick discussion about the value added. But really, I want you to read, the main thing is sort of how people can evade, how people evade taxes. Because there is sort of this myth out there that the value added tax is an efficient tax, that people can always, like, it's easier to collect the value added tax because it's self-reported, self-enforced. But that's not true. You can cheat on the value added tax. And so this particular report, while it's long, the first 5 pages will go through how people cheat on it. I don't want you to go home and say, like, we learned how to cheat on our taxes.
Oh.
That's not the point of
No,
reading.
my income is not that level. I don't need to cheat. I'm low income, so there is no space for cheat.
So what else do I have? And then decentralization, that's an older paper, but it's sort of, again, it's sort of like a longer report, but it has sort of a section on pros of decentralization and cons of decentralization. It might be a good reference point to look at to round out the reading in the book. Because the book chapters are sort of short and very compressed, so I need to give you extra material if you want to look up something in more detail, like the value added tax. What is it? How does it work? Decentralization, what's the logic behind decentralization? Because the books are sort of very short. They pack a lot of material in short chapters. So to give you a little bit access, again, optional readings are optional readings. I don't expect you to read everything that I put on. It's something you can look into. You don't have to read the whole report. Just look at the table of contents and see, oh, here's 3 pages that are really interesting. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I want to give you sort of a reference library that you can delve into. Okay?
Okay.
All right. All right. Models of comparative public budgeting. So now let me see. Oh, no, that's not going to work. If I sit down, I'm still on that camera, but I'm okay. Before we go into models of comparative budgeting, I want to know, what do you think a government should do? What are some of the functions that you think the government should do for its citizens?
Provide services,
What kind of services? Very specific.
healthcare,
Healthcare.
education.
Let's start. Okay, healthcare, education. What else?
How to say, the basics such as road,
Infrastructure.
bridge, yeah, this word.
Yes. Road, bridges,
Yeah.
canals, harbors, ports, airports.
Yes,
Broadband. Remember, infrastructure is more than just sort of, it's broadband and other things. Other things.
security,
What kind of security?
like the police,
Okay, domestics. What?
domestics,
National security as well.
National security, security external borders. Let's stay with domestic security. What do we want governments to do? So police, what is a police supposed to do in your view?
Enforce the law.
Enforce. Yes, but the law to which end?
keep us safe.
Keep you safe. So protect your life from harm from others. What else? What else does, even in China, the police do?
They will not.
They do a lot.
Yeah, they, such as protect traditional culture.
Traditional culture. So secret police and sort of moral police. We have this in this country too, so let's not. Private property, right? Protect private property. Stealing, I assume, is illegal in China as well as in most other countries. Even, or the collective is, right? You're not allowed to steal from the collective. I know very little about China, a little bit. So you can laugh at this and you can say Christian, that's unlike. What are other things? Healthcare, education, national security, domestic security, against terrorism, right? Protecting against harm from others, private property. China is a rapidly aging country, as is the US. So, retirement, right? Making sure old people do not have to starve. Isn't that a goal that we want for governments? You seem hesitant. Is that not a conversation in China? What happens when people get old?
They extend the retirement date. They,
6 years.
make it long. To 6
So everybody in China has to work till they're 95?
They were
65.
65. But there's, I mean, China has a fairly high longevity. Right? So there's a lot of people who are older than 65. What happens? Is this a conversation in China?
They will help that child with that grandchild. So they will always be.
They will always be busy.
Yeah,
No, but there's
I
no,
know, healthcare, healthcare, medical.
there's no income from the government.
Basically, no.
They will have the retirement salary. It's just
But only
people
RMB per month.
Sorry?
no,
They get retirement salary
yes from the
Yeah, yeah.
farmer.
They get it, but I mean, just a late.
It's just a little, but they get some.
Yeah, that's,
Healthcare, retirement health.
yeah.
I mean, it's surprising, but I would imagine that this is becoming an increasing issue. Right? I mean, the longer, like, better healthcare means people can live longer. That doesn't mean they can work longer, right? I mean, China still has a large population in agriculture, has a large population in working manufacturing, meaning in physically demanding jobs. And at some point, even with the best healthcare, yes, people can live to 95, but they can't work in the fields when they're 75. Their health is just not there. And as a society, as your share of population over 75 is rapidly growing, and this is a challenge for us in the United States too. It's a challenge in Germany, also. What do? How do you finance that growing share of retirement? Is that, and it's a question, is that a responsibility for the government? Or is it a responsibility for the children? Is that a private family matter? Is that something that traditional families should band together in the village and support the elderly? What else should governments do? What else do governments do?
I think government is an institution that allocate resource.
Sorry?
I mean, they collect resource and then they have it to people.
Okay.
And it's a kind of a big concept that I'm talking. But I think what they do is to give away resource to citizens. And
So income inequality, effective income inequality. You take from some people, you give to somebody else.
yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, but you don't collect taxes just for the sake of it. It's not like, oh, today I'm a tax man, this is not fun. You do it because you want to give the money to somebody. In most cases, you take some money from high income earners, from the rich, and you spend it on the poor, the elderly, the indigent, on vulnerable population groups, sometimes politically. shovel money, Mongolia, whatever, to keep people happy, that might become racist. It's a political decision that comes with it, right? And again, I'm making stuff up, but it seems that that's at least, this is what the United States does. It takes money from the rich coastal states and it gives it to the poor southern states.
So it's the income redistribution.
It's income redistribution. Governments do this all the time. Let's stay with sort of what governments do, and then we ask whether this makes sense. What else do governments do?
Keeps the society stability.
Political stability, civil liberties, but also control of media to some degree. What? I come from Germany, and we recently had this event here in Charlottesville, right? The neo-Nazis, the fascists, moving through the streets, causing a ruckus and murders. And there was a real conversation about civil liberties in this country versus civil liberties in Germany. The freedom of speech in Germany is more limited. You cannot show the Nazi flag, you cannot have the Nazi rating, you cannot bring, nowadays you can because copyright finally expired, you can't actually read Hitler's books in Germany, but for 50 years you couldn't. You cannot be a Nazi party. It's outlawed. Nazi speech is outlawed in Germany. It's hate speech. So countries decide, and we have the same thing, we have this conversation now, should Confederate statues be demolished in public spaces? Should they move into museums? So what are civil liberties? Where are the limits, right? To some degree, because we want stability, we want equality.
To keep protect the human rights.
Protecting human rights, but what is that? And again, it's a little bit different. Protection of human rights in this case is different from political stability and political equality.
It's called equality.
And sort of like, what do we need to do, and what role does the government play in equality? What else? Big issues. You said you're from Beijing, right?
Yeah.
What's the big issue in Beijing? Traffic jams? I've seen pictures where around like 10 o'clock in the morning, you don't really see much about Beijing.
Pollution.
Pollution! Environmental protection and pollution. Keeping your citizens healthy, clean water, clean air, seem to be growing concerns. And not just in China, not just in Beijing. India wrestles with that. LA wrestled with that for years. In New Orleans, continuously conversation about rebuilding the wetlands to protect a city that's basically on the water below sea level is protected from storm surges. And we're going to have this conversation about Houston, Texas, right? And we're going to have this conversation in Mexico, right? Because Mexico not only got hit with this awful earthquake, they also got hit by a tropical storm, and that causes landslides, especially after an earthquake, right? How do you build that kind of infrastructure? What else do governments do?
Keep a good relationship to other countries.
How do we do that? Diplomacy, so that falls under national, but what else do we do? One of the prime functions of government, one of the earliest functions, dating back to the Renaissance, engaging in international commerce, right? Signing treaties of trade is one of the key functions beyond national security that we assign to government. It's one of the earliest functions of government. As soon as nation states, as soon as states started forming, this is how Italy, this is how the Italian city-states became rich. They started trading with each other. They started commerce. And they found a way to finance that commerce. Right? You all know this, right? The term bank comes from La Banca, for money changing. That's how Italian, Northern Italian cities became rich, right? That stuff, like financing commerce, financing trade between countries, That was one of the key functions of early states, as we know them today as modern states. That exhausts my list. I have 12, and I think you mentioned all 12. I'm not saying you list. Just because we find a long list and we sort of seem to think, yeah, I thought there would be a little bit more enthusiasm for retirement security for old Chinese people in this class. I think it will become a bigger issue over time. It is an issue elsewhere. But beyond that, healthcare, education, these are, we can sort of say, okay, well, this is sort of what we agree on what governments do, and there's probably a few others. Just because we say healthcare or education doesn't mean that we all mean the same thing. And that every country offers these things, means the same things. What is the level of healthcare? The healthcare that you receive through the government in the United Kingdom or in Germany or Switzerland is quite different than what you receive through the government, even sort of the quasi-government institutions that we have that we call Obamacare in this country, right? And the level of healthcare, I just had this conversation with a student today who wanted to know sort of what healthcare looks like or retirement looks like in Sweden. And yes, it's instructive to see what a country like Sweden is willing to do in terms of healthcare for its citizens. But just because Sweden is willing to do that doesn't mean we can say like, well, Sweden does it, so China should do it. The culture, the norms, the revenue streams, the economy are quite different. And to be honest, the population, the demographics are different, the healthcare needs are different. We need to be mindful of those things. Well, it's important to understand how some of these services have arrived, how we're doing this, how we're financing that is important. And it gives us insights on how potentially a country like China or the United States or England or France could change. It doesn't, like, the levels, the trends, the reforms, the evolutions of spending on these issues will be different from country to country. They're driven by cultural, social, historical norms. We have to be mindful of that. Like, think about something like national security. It is a fundamental function of government securing its external borders. I think the only country in the world, and even they have a military at this point, is Bhutan, right? But everybody else has a military that wants to secure its national border, and I think for Bhutan simply was, for the longest time, not a necessity because nobody could get to Bhutan, right? So it's like, well, we don't need an army, we have the mountains. Does everybody know where Bhutan is? Bhutan is a Himalayan state. They have gross happiness product, north of, sort of next to Sikkim, India.
Oh, yeah.
It's a time that the king got photographed and like a crop top, and it was like this huge, like,
Bhutan?
yeah.
All right.
It was like this huge scandal.
It was a
He's
scandal?
not supposed to be photographed.
Really?
So
Is it one of those God kings?
I think so, yeah.
They actually have, they're in a military conflict with either China or India. Because the border, they're next to Sikkim. Sikkim is a state of India, and so hard. You could only reach them for a while by plane. I still think you can only reach them by plane, helicopter. They hide very close, but I'm pretty sure they have a military. They're sort of the happiest people in the world. But think about a country, like when you compare the share of spending on military between, for instance, France and Germany. France spends a much higher share of its gross domestic product on the military because it defines its national security needs quite differently than Germany. To some degree, because of historical needs and historical development. France didn't start 2 world wars and didn't get clobbered in both of those wars, and didn't bring absolute misery to the world. France took it upon its own responsibility to some degree as a repayment to America, to say, like, they liberated us from the Germans, the Nazis, after World War II. We owe it to the Americans to participate in securing world peace. So France, for instance, has always been a much more reliable partner in terms of engaging in international ventures. Broadly defined, France actually was first in Vietnam. Germany is still called Indochina before the Americans took over. France did engage in the first Iraq War. France refused to go along. This sort of would cause the rift between France and the United States in the 2003 war in Iraq. But it did send troops to Afghanistan. Whereas Germany sent only observers, they never sent troops, except for Kosovo and Somalia. So you have, while every country, in France and Germany have so much in common in terms of history, geography. Like, I grew up in an area that for the longest time was France, and then it was Germany, and now it's France over the centuries, right? These are countries that are tightly bound together by history. And yet the way they define their national security interests and budget for the national security interests are quite different. So we have to be mindful of that. That is true for retirement, that's true for healthcare, right? To say we provide healthcare. In the United States, for instance, this is sort of a big point when it comes to healthcare. We actually have, by and large, a right to health. We had this before Obama. What we didn't have is a right to health insurance. So if you got sick in the United States, and you didn't have health insurance, in most cases, you just waited until you really couldn't move anymore. You went to the emergency room when you had time, and that was your health care. And the emergency room couldn't refuse you service. That's health care. That's not health care that most people want, and that's also not health care that most people need, but it's the health care that they could get without health insurance. Whereas in other countries, and Obamacare now defines health care differently by setting minimum standards for everybody. Everybody has to have health insurance, and there's minimum things that need to be covered. We redefine the right to health care through Obama. But that's, again, it's been a long process that took 50 years to do. So while we can agree on education, healthcare, national security, domestic security, as sort of primary goals, we need to understand the specifics in each country, what these things mean, what the level, what that actually entails. And part of this conversation that we need to investigate and examine when we look at budget categories, what countries spend money on, is the question of what's the responsibility of private citizens. Almost every country other than North Korea these days relies, and even North Korea has a little bit of a market economy going. Most countries have some market activity in their economy. And so the question is, what's the responsibility of private citizens, either through the market or through informal networks, to provide part of the services? What's the split between government responsibilities and private responsibilities? That will determine how much money the government will spend on various activities. And part of the question that we will investigate is, should the government incentivize people to do more by themselves? Say, like, again, we'll give you a tax break if you do X. Or we'll punish you if you don't. If you drive a dirty diesel car in the middle of Beijing during rush hour, you're going to pay a penalty. Think about, I don't know, Beijing, how Beijing handles this, but I can tell you how Athens, which is another city that has really bad pollution. They just basically said, if you have an odd number on your license plate, the last number is a 13579, you only drive Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and if you're even number, you drive Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday. And on Sunday, nobody comes. Or
So some families they buy 2 cars. Yeah. When the single number, every home has 2 cars.
awesome.
So it's not a efficient way.
Well, that's the other part. How do citizens? Citizens are particularly creative when it comes to
Yes.
circumvent the taxes and regulations by the government. Okay. We will, while we talk about a lot of these government efforts, we will over time ask which ones of those have a lot of government spending or tax effects. Some of the things we talk about are regulatory issues like pollution regulations, so we'll move that to the side since that's a regulatory issue, not necessarily a spending issue. The other part we're going to talk a little bit about next week is tax revenue. Do they have a revenue, right? Either through penalties or through tax incentives. We'll give you a tax break if you put a solar panel on your house. I don't know whether China does that, but the US did it and still does it for tax break. If you buy a more efficient washer, we'll give you a tax break. But that's a loss of revenue. And we need to understand, is it an efficient loss? Are we just rewarding people for doing things they would have done anyway? Bike sharing programs, taking public transit, those kinds of things. They're massive, they're very, very costly. And the question is, are we really getting something for the money that we're losing, or do we need to rethink the way we do the budgets, the revenue side? Okay, how are we doing on time?
It's almost 7.
Sorry?
It's almost 7 o'clock.
7 o'clock?
It's 6:55.
All right, so I get to talk for 1 more hour?
Yeah.
Awesome! All right. Then I don't have to rush as much as that. The other questions we have to ask is, which government covers the expenses and the revenue, right? Who is responsible for domestic national security? Yeah, we usually don't leave to individual states or cities. That's a national function. Domestic security, police, and I don't know, what's the function in China? Is that a national police or is it more like a city or a state or a district function?
It's city station.
Domestic security tends to be more from a regional or city, district level function. I mean, think about, right, the US. We have, look, think about this. UMass Boston, and sometimes we borrow police from UMass Lowell. And then we have transit police, and we have City of Boston police. And then we have, because we like to do things very complicated here in Boston, we have the police in Quincy, and we have the police in Brookline and Cambridge, because they're all their own cities. And then we have the state police. And then if you traffic across state lines, the FBI. Oh, and if you do cross state lines while you're on the train, the Amtrak police. And the postal office has its own police. Because it's a federal agency. So domestic security is a hodgepodge, but in most countries it's
How often does the National Guard and like law enforcement tend to collaborate?
hopefully not that often. It's supposed to. We're not a military state. The National Guard is really there just to help out in emergencies. Calling in National Guard for functions that are domestic security makes Americans generally feel uneasy because it brings in a military force designed to fight the war against the external enemy. To quash a domestic crime.
I was just asking because I was reading, I think it was a business insider article today, and in the post-Harvey reconstruction efforts, they're bringing in the National Guard to spray like insect repellent over the city. So
something like that, where it's simply like the typical police force is overwhelmed with other functions. I mean, you got to remember, They're overwhelmed with relocating prisoners. They're overwhelmed with just simply rebuilding their own lives, right? They live in Houston or they live in New Orleans, right? Their own houses are up, their own cars, their own lives are updated. So you need to bring in outside forces, and to some degree, the National Guard has some technology and some functions that are just easier done through the National Guard than others. But ideally, it's issues. There was a discussion, and I don't know where that went, whether we should bring in the National Guard to help out in Chicago with this wave of murders and gang violence. There is the famous civil rights case of Alabama, where the National Guard basically had to come in and enforce the federal order to integrate the schools, meaning blacks and whites would go together to school because the governor of Alabama refused to integrate the schools. Those are sort of very touchy issues because all of a sudden you're bringing in a federal force designed to protect you against external enemies into an internal conflict and to override state rights by force. That is a very touchy issue for in the United States, where we heavily emphasize state rights due to historical context. But it raises questions of who pays for what at government levels. Generally, it's police and it's education. Education, at least in most somewhat federal systems, tend to be under state or regional districts. Whereas in centralized unitary governments, it's sort of like that's the federal government and the government that funds the money through. How does this organized in China? Who pays for the universities? Is that just the federal government? Is there a central government? And you have sort of districts, right? I don't. Is that how China is organized?
There are two kinds of university in China. Some of the university is funded by the central government, and then some of the local universities, such as UMass Boston, is the state university. So in China, some of the province university that are funded by the province.
The
government.
province?
Yeah.
Okay.
And you know, the difference between the U.S. government and the Chinese government is there are no, a state government, or there are no big difference with state government and central government. They're just
It's all one big happy party.
yeah.
Okay.
So,
No, I mean, I as I said, like I know a little bit about China. I don't know that much. Happy to learn more. But again, we need to look at how is this organized? What does it mean in terms of who decides, right? Of how much money the university gets. Is it the central government in Beijing or the provincial government? And it will probably depend on interpersonal relationships between the provincial governor and the central government within the party. Like who can sort of work it behind the scenes better, who can lobby. There's other factors. We need to be mindful of that. With that, let's just go into sort of the bigger theoretical concepts, and then we'll sort of come back to this issue. In particular, there is this Wildavsky framework, which is described in both of the textbooks very briefly. Basically, it's sort of a very basic framework that makes the argument that what kind of government, what kind of budget the country will have will depend on whether the country is rich or poor. And we'll refine that a little bit next week. Because it's not just simply rich or poor, it depends on what you make with the resources you have. How effectively you levy resources that you have. But also, how certain is your budget environment? how many conflicts you have between different parts of the country with your external neighbors, but also if you're heavily natural resource dependent, your budget environment is very difficult to predict. Like if your primary resource of revenue is oil or gas, and those prices are determined by world markets, one year, everybody gets a Rolls Royce. You get a Rolls Royce, you get a Rolls Royce, you get a Rolls Royce, and you get a Rolls Royce. And next year, you all have to stand in a break. This is sort of where Alaska is, where to some degree Russia is. Countries that are so heavily dependent on natural resource revenue live in a fairly uncertain budget environment. That can be uncertainty associated with the revenue stream. Now, here's an example that we just saw. Hurricane Irma was rushing through the Caribbean. The primary resource of revenue for the Caribbean is what? Where do they get the money from? Other than tax havens. What else? Tourism. These are all spots in the sun. Sun, surf, and fun, right? Nobody's going to be out to Antigua this year. There's nothing there. People will not go to Puerto Rico because you don't know where the hotels are going to actually running water and running electricity. Right? St. Martin has been destroyed. Large parts, it will take months. And now is their season, the winter season after the hurricane season. This is their season. This is when it, and this is, like, it's not just the hurricanes that destroyed it. Irma did incredible damage to Florida. It did some damage to Florida, but it did incredible damage in many of the tourist spots of the Caribbean. St. Martin's or Virgin Islands, these are islands that live on tourism. Right? And tourism can be an incredibly volatile revenue source. Think about Indonesia, right? Bali is a big spot for tourists, Australian tourists, European tourists. But all of a sudden, there's a nightclub bombing and another bombing, and tourism goes down. And the revenue sources are gone. There's nothing else that replaces that. Your budget environment is fairly uncertain. If you have a very undiversified economy, which if you're a small country that has 30,000 people, I don't know how many people live in Bali, but Barbados has something like 30,000. Right? There isn't much room. You don't have agriculture, you have a little bit of fishing, you have a little bit of banking, but by and large, you live on tourism. And if you have one stream of resources, be that natural resources, and tourism is sort of a natural resource industry, you live in a fairly uncertain budget environment. Political instability. Right? Think a country like Nigeria. Nigeria has a lot of money from oil. Right? It's an oil-rich country. It has other natural resources, but it has also incredible tribal conflicts that can wreak havoc on the pipelines. There's these tribes in the Delta, the Niger Delta, that for the longest time would attack the pipeline, blow them up because they didn't get their promised share of the revenues. You see this in the Congo even worse. Right? Conflicts like this, you can't be natural resource rich, which creates already a source of uncertainty. And then you have tribal conflicts over the revenue streams that come into this. Right? And all of a sudden, you have uncertainty layered over uncertainty. And you can be relatively rich countries, but you have a fairly uncertain budget environment. So the Vygotsky framework basically says you basically have a 2x2 matrix. You're either rich or poor, and you have a certain or uncertain environment. If you have a rich country like US and you have a certain budget environment, you should have incremental budgets, meaning this year's budget is a little bit above last year's budget. You sort of grow, you adjust things, you shift a little bit from this agency to that agency where your needs are. The US is a good example of how certainty can change this, how increasing uncertainty changes. We have now lived through about 10 years of incredible political instability, uncertainty. And we're living through this right now. Because we have two parties that do not want to work with each other. Well, until 2003, they were okay working together. So it's been 14 years. The last sort of big, massive, let's get together and do something big for the country was No Child Left Behind. Since then, the two parties are really friendly. And the problem is, they're playing a game of chicken. Who blames first? And right now we see this, right? We don't know what's happening. We have lifted the debt ceiling, which is a uniquely American phenomenon, right? The country runs a deficit, and that's all signed off. But by the time we need to pay the bills, we get to a point where the government says, well, you know, we said we would pay the bills, but maybe we're rethinking us now because we have this thing called the debt ceiling. Let's talk about whether we actually pay the bills we said we would pay. And so President Trump and the Democrats just struck this deal that says, we're going to raise the debt ceiling, but we're going to raise it to December. And then we're going to do the whole thing over again. What that means is so much political energy is being sapped up by this fight over if we raise the debt ceiling or not, which used to be sort of like, yeah, we'll do it, let's move on. So a few years ago, this became a big fight. What that means is there is no energy left to negotiate over a budget. And so what we end up with is an incredibly uncertain environment where we basically operate with something called continuing resolutions. Do you know what continuing resolutions are in the United States? What happens with a continuing resolution? Yes?
Sorry, but what is continuing resolution?
With a continuing resolution, so every country, right, typically passes a budget for, let's say, a year. And then we negotiate over, should we raise the budget? Do we cut taxes? Do we shift money from national security to schools? With a continuing resolution, you're basically just saying, we're going to keep on doing what we did last year. Whether we need it, right? We're still fighting wars from 5 years ago with our budgets. That's not true. We actually passed the budget 2 years. But for 5 years, we didn't have a budget. It was always continuing resolutions. So we kept spending money on things that we didn't need, and we didn't spend money on things we did need. The point is, this bipartisan standard that the United States has been living has created an increase in the uncertain budget environment, and thereby sort of require something, what do they call it, repetitive. That is, we have to renegotiate the budgets over the course of the year. The way this happens in the United States, when we were fighting the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan during the Bush years, the fighting in the wars was not part of the budgets. The government, Congress would pass a budget, and then President Bush said, oh, and by the way, I need an extra $150 billion for the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Can you pass a supplemental bill? It was not part of the budget. It was one of the first things that President Obama did. He's like, we're done with these shenanigans. It's going to be part of the budget, and we're going to count properly. And we're going to do this on a long-term way, and we're going to plan to withdraw troops from Afghanistan and Iraq. Right? But if you have these scandals, you move things to these supplemental budgets, and all of a sudden, this whole thing goes haywire. You think you have a deficit of $200 billion or $300 billion for the United States, which is 2% of GDP. But all of a sudden, there's a supplemental bill for this, and there's a supplemental bill for that, like hurricanes. Right? We don't know. We don't have a budget, but we're spending $17 billion on hurricanes. I'm not begrudging Texas $17 billion, but we should have a budget. Our fiscal year starts on October 1st. We're 3 weeks away. And there's not anything resembling serious budget. And there's talk about taxes. It's a massive tax. Again, you can be a rich country, have an uncertain political environment where budgets look like totally messy, have to be redone and rejiggered, or we just pass the buck. We just say like, well, continuing resolution, we'll see you next year, we'll see whatever we can find better.
Not to defend President Bush, but also I think prior to 2003, it wasn't very clear that we would be engaging in a war, or maybe it was because of what
We already were in Afghanistan.
Correct.
And he had,
But in Iraq, we weren't, and of course not to defend the war in Iraq, but that is something that wouldn't have been accounted for in a budget regardless, I feel. So my question is, I guess, and this does tie into, again, like hurricane relief efforts and stuff, but in terms of extenuating circumstances when, let's say, we decide to engage in a war and we do need supplementary money to that, or a hurricane hits or an earthquake happens and we need to send in more money to rebuild. I'm not asking where does that money come from, but how does Congress decide that this is how we're going to allocate that money?
well, you don't know that a hurricane hits. You don't necessarily want to budget year after year after year for Irma and a Harvey or Katrina and Wilma, and then you have 12 years of nothing, and you have basic money in reserves. You do want to, however, make sure that the basic emergency infrastructure is built out, so that FEMA, the Red Cross, and others that receive some government contracts have the capacity to jump in if there's a natural disaster. We tend to have a fair amount of natural disasters. You got to remember, while our eyes were trained on the hurricanes to a large degree, we had this massive wave, we still have this massive wave of wildfires out in California, Montana, and other mountains that require emergency services. Now, the $17 billion supplemental budget, that's what supplemental should be for. The question is, would they be smaller if we adequately fund the emergency services, the first responders? Who knows? It's also in a $1.8 trillion economy, $17 trillion economy, an extra $17 billion isn't that much. The bigger question is Iraq, right? The question is not so much did we know whether President Bush wanted to go to war in Iraq. I think that was clear pretty much right after 9/11 that he wanted to. The problem was not only, I mean, we can disagree or agree with the move to have a war in Iraq, but when President Bush and the cabinet said, we're going to go and take on Saddam Hussein, there was this narrative of, we're going to be done, we're going to be greeted as liberators, and we're going to be done in 3 months. Remember the mission accomplished aircraft carrier picture where President Bush put on a fighter jacket and had the mission accomplished banner behind him. It became an iconic signal of Cubans. Because everybody could see from the pictures that were coming out of Iraq, nothing is accomplished, and we're going to be there for years. We're in Iraq now for 14 years. We still have troops there. We're still fighting against ISIS and Al-Qaeda and all of those terrorist groups. And to a large degree, anybody in the foreign policy, national security establishment knew that this is going to be a mess and there's going to be unforeseen costs. In supplemental budgets, treat it as if something that this will be over in 6 months. When everybody who knew something about it knew this will be a long-term effort and we should plan for it. And we should, like, we are going to engage in nation building and we need to budget. That's different from Harvey. Now, we do have to have a conversation about what will $17 billion give us in Texas. Is that just simply emergency services helping people rebuild the houses? Or are we going to make a serious effort of shoring up the flood protections and infrastructure in Texas so it doesn't happen again? Houston is very flood prone, and that's sort of a different question. Should, this is sort of a federal conversation, should the federal government, as part of its deals, we're going to give you $17 billion, but in exchange, you're going to help us rebuild your floodwaters. And to some degree, we did this in New Orleans, right? FEMA and everybody came in, but the Army Corps of Engineers also had a mandate to shore up the levees and make sure this doesn't happen. And everybody agreed. Katrina was such a source of enormous human suffering. Thousands of lives there. An entire city decimated.
There's still areas in New Orleans, like parishes that people still don't live in. And we're over 10 years past Katrina, so.
But there was a commitment from the federal government to put money into education. And there was a commitment from private individuals, from private donations. And there was sort of a national conversations about how can we, now, some of it was an ugly conversation. It was about, like, basically, how can we make New Orleans whiter? Maybe I'll be honest about that.
There's a huge gentrification problem now. I guess that leads me to a follow-up question of, I guess in my limited understanding of budgeting so far, why state, federal, and local governments to some degree, they're less likely to invest in infrastructure development, the huge cost at the onset to make sure, I guess, the job is done properly and correctly will last for years to come and are more in favor of, despite the difference in cost clearly, they're more in favor of Band-Aid solutions.
Can we move the infrastructure conversation to next week?
Yeah, absolutely.
To some degree, because it's a fairly complex issue. And so giving you a short answer, and it is already part of the Ghana conversation. So remind me next week.
Yeah, absolutely.
So poor countries with certain budget environments should engage in the revenue budget. Is the last revenue budget is basically you're a poor country, there isn't that much room to give, so you first project, you basically act like business. You say, okay, well, how much money am I going to get coming in? What's the likely revenue sources? And then you're going to spend it. This is basically how UMass Boston has to do its budget. The reason for this is not we're not poor, but the reason why is if you're a rich country or a large country, right? If you're Japan, right?
I don't think your large country can do this.
Yeah, if you're a large country, what do? You go in a capital market. You go to the IMF. You're like, man, give me a few $1 billion. You issue bonds, you can borrow. If you're an unknown quantity, like nobody knows UMass Boston on global capital markets. They know the UMass system, and we do sort of issue bonds on the used bond market as UMass, but not as UMass Boston. Right? And so if you're a poor country, and I think, let me see, like Burundi or Bhutan, so some of the poorest countries in the world, you basically, what you can get from your citizens, plus some extra aid from grants and loans from aid agencies, and a little bit of money from the World Bank, that's it. There is no, let's go to New York or Tokyo, or Frankfurt, and they'll give us money. Now, for China, doesn't have an issue because it's surplus. But if you ran a deficit, that's what you could do. Maybe you're China, Japan, or Germany. But if you're poor, you can't do that. Nobody's going to lend you money. Or if they do lend you money, they're going to do it at such exorbitant interest rates, you're not willing to take it. So even if you're certain processes that you can predict this, then you predict the revenue that's coming in from sales taxes, from income taxes, from property taxes, and that's the money that you're going to then allocate to the budget that you have. Poor country with certain processes. If you are a poor country with uncertain environments, you have repetitive budget. That is, you do your best for the next few months, and then you get together and you try to figure out, okay, well, how can we plug this hole? How can we plug that hole? here's something else, here's some money that did come in unexpectedly and we'll spend it on there, or less money came in from this and we'll spend it on, we'll have to cut somewhere else, but you readjust the budget all the time. Repetitive budget. You can't plan. The problem, this goes to your question, right? In an environment like this, there is no planning for a new road or a new airport. You can barely pay to keep the lights on in the state house, or to pay your teachers, or to keep the hospitals open, or to pay the generators. You have brownouts or blackouts all the time. Right? Electricity is only available from 8 in the morning till 3 in the afternoon in this block, and the next people over get it for another 5 hours, and then for a week nobody gets anything until we figure out how to. There is no infrastructure in this. This is for poor countries with uncertain budget environments, meaning there is either, because you're dependent on resources, like natural resource revenues that fluctuate a lot, you have internal conflicts, you have corruption, there's all these factors that come into it. Okay? And we're going to look at it. Okay. The other uncertainty, we're going to talk about some of the uncertainty that we want to talk specifically here in this class. We're going to spend some time talking about economic volatility, having ups and downs caused, for instance, by fluctuation in natural resource markets, oil and gas. We're going to talk about repeated financial crises. There are some countries that repeatedly go through financial crises, nation crises. This is true for Turkey, this is true for Russia, this is true for Egypt historically. So countries, Mexico, that repeatedly, or every 10 years or so, have major financial crises. Brazil, right? And that creates an enormous drain on your natural resources, makes planning very, very complicated. Political means that corruption, internal strife, tribal strife. China has some of that. You're a large country, you're an ethnically diverse country. Russia has this still, right, with some of the restive regions. We have not as violent, obviously, in the United States, but regional conflicts do exist. So we're going to talk some of these conflicts in whether, for instance, like what they mean on the economic side, how budgets can help mitigate them in theory, how we can sort of fix some of the economic stability, how we can, like, if you are heavily resource dependent, how can you use your budgets to potentially steer against that? One thing is you build big reserves during the good years and you just shove money into the economy when the times are tough, right? You have a reserve fund. Or you start, this is sort of what a lot of the Gulf states do, you start building a more diverse economy, moving away from oil towards, for instance, higher education or tourism or something else, or finance, right? You sort of get away from the dependence on one revenue source. Political instability, how you sort of have greater accountability, you weed out, how do you weed out corruption, but the other part is also this sort of decentralization comes in. How do you devolve control over the budget to different regions in the country to give them a little bit more autonomy? You're going to talk about Italy. So Italy had this struggle with its northern region. The Italian name for that is Alto Adige, but the German name is South Tyrol. It actually has a German-speaking minority that Mussolini tried to squash by bringing in a lot of Italian speakers from the south. That created a lot of unrest in that region. Constant conflict between the 1940s and the 1980s until finally the central government in Rome said, we're going to make you an autonomous region. You get control over your budgets, you get control over your schools, over your culture, you can speak German again, we don't repress you. We don't make you your own independent country, which South Tyrol wanted to basically join Austria or Germany. But we're not going to give you up, you're going to stay with us. But we're going to sort of give you a lot of more control over your own lives. That's an example of it has sort of calmed down a lot. I mean, there's still tensions and conflict because we now have a large Italian minority there that is overwhelmed by a German-speaking majority. But that's the kind of evolution, part of decentralization that is meant to create more civil stability and thereby greater certainty in the budgeting process. Okay? We will look at different historical, cultural similarities, cultural norms as far as they come to budgeting. We distinguish 5, and this is the part of the discussion in this book. Different typologies of budgets. One is the French system. This is, you've obviously found France, but also in former French colonies, especially in Africa. Highly centralized governments, unitary government that then has some functions and some decisions made at the local level. Heavy emphasis on the executive branch, especially the treasury, drives a lot of the budget processes. Coordinates it, drives it, says this is what we're doing because we have to finance it. We know how much money is coming in. This is when we're going to collect the information how much you want to spend, and we tell you whether you can spend or not. The Iberian or Spanish system, which you find more sort of in Latin America, Caribbean. Again, you have a sort of heavy hand of the central government, but some revenue sharing between the central government and local and regional governments. There are some examples that some countries are able to change their rules by giving gradually more control to the local governments. Again, we're talking about sort of the challenges of giving, like evolving, like handing responsibilities for the budget from the central government to local governments. The problem is that a lot of the decisions still within the Iberian system are made by, there's no central government authority made by the agencies, so the Department of Defense, the Department of Human Services, the Department of Education. They make their own budgets, they raise their own funds possibly, and there's no really sort of a uniform budget that tells us how much does the government actually spend and how much revenue does it get in. And so you have to add up these agency budgets and figure out, okay, what's the total deficit that we have to worry about. The United States government is unique. We give a lot of resources. We have some responsibilities within the federal government. So we distinguish in budget language between consumption and investment spending on the one side. That is sort of the government, the federal government hires people. An IRS commissioner, auditor, someone, tax collector, or a soldier. That's consumption. The government builds a building. That's investment. Builds a highway. That's investment. The government, on the other hand, the federal government in particular, has another function that's called transfer payments. It collects money, you said that earlier, it takes money in and then spends it on other functions. It concentrates money, taxes, and gives it across the spectrum and gives it out for particular purposes. And that's actually sort of the largest individual chunks of the federal government in the United States. Social Security is a transfer payment. We collect money, not for you, not for mine, because we work for the state of Massachusetts, we're not covered by Social Security. But generally, in the United States, we collect money from workers in the form of tax, also payroll taxes, Social Security taxes. We take that money and we give it in large part for people, for the elderly who are retired, we give it to people who are on disability, or for the primary earner has died, survivorship benefits for widows and children. That's a transfer payment. Medicare and Medicaid are transfer payments. The money comes in for taxes, we pay it out as health insurance for either the elderly or the poor. Those are transfer. There's a bunch of other transfer. That's actually the single largest chunks. Whereas if you look at the state governments, states increasingly have taken on what we consider consumption and investment responsibilities. So more and more, the state governments are taking on building roads, building schools, building up universities. Those are the government hiring people, hiring teachers, police, firefighter, construction workers, and so on and so forth, and investing in the economy. The state governments spend about twice as much on consumption investment than the federal government does. Now, they do get some help sometimes, not much, from the federal government. The federal government for education, not higher education, we get very little from the federal government, but for education, meaning kindergarten through 12th grade, the federal government spends about 12%. So the majority of that is state and local government. So the United States has and we've increasingly shifted these budgetary responsibilities, key functions, such as healthcare, unemployment insurance, retirement assistance, less so, education to the states. That's called, and other social services. How administering a whole bunch of social programs. That's more and more responsibility of the state and local governments. Does that make sense? So, but it's a unique system in the world where, yes, we have a federal government, but in terms of budgetary issues, a lot of it happens at the state level. This is, and what the federal government does, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, is already so heavily enshrined in long-term budgets. It is, we call those mandatory spending. That's what the government entitlements. That's what the government has to spend unless it is a major legislative reform. So this is why when it comes to basic budgets, and sort of many social and government priorities, people are a little bit like, this is stuff that President Trump or President Obama had a hard time touching. Because red states, Texas, or Louisiana, could do whatever they want. Right? Because so much we have given more in terms of education, in terms of healthcare, so much responsibility already was with the states. So Obamacare tried to change this and bring a stronger role for the federal government, and President Trump tried to pull back from that. But by and large, many of these areas are state responsibilities. And a huge chunk of what the federal government does is, again, sort of hard to touch. Again, sort of big ticket items, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, military, and then it's veterans after that. It's stuff that just is on autopilot, runs, grows, it's automatically increased every year. It's the other stuff, it's much smaller social programs that could potentially come under attack. This is sort of also why so much action, both during President Obama's time, but also President Trump's time, is not on the budget side. Because the budget is sort of like, the president doesn't have as much influence. This is why so much in the end, during the second term, well, most time during Obama, and also now during President Trump's term, is on the regulatory side. What can president do through executive orders, through regulations that do not require congressional approval? This is sort of why President Trump quickly got into signing all these orders. President Obama did the same thing, just in the other direction. British system. You have a centralized unitary state. It's not a federal system. A lot of, basically, the government collects the revenue and then shares it with the local authorities. Local authorities have some budgetary control over how much they can spend. The federal government becomes to some degree a pass-through. And then we have the legacy of the Soviet-controlled countries in the Central and Eastern Bloc There is sort of the legacy. It's often a lack of transparent system. So a lot of interpersonal networks determine who gets what, how decisions are made. There's sort of minimum requirements that governments have to spend X on Y. Like you have to spend this much money on housing or healthcare, but beyond that, it becomes sort of a very informal, ad hoc process. Okay. How are we doing on time? Sure? 20 minutes. Okay. All right. We have a number of steps, but the basic issue here becomes, while we have sort of the basic Wildavsky model that says, okay, you're a rich and certain, you're poor in country with a certain environment, or you're rich with an uncertain environment, poor with an uncertain environment, and that predicts what kind of budgets, long-term planning you have. You're rich and certain, you're going to have incremental budgets because you can afford to be wrong by small margin. Poor and certain, you can't. You have to engage in revenue budget. You predict the revenue, you're pretty certain that that's what you're going to have, but you can't really afford it. As we just talked about, your cultural norms will then determine who makes those budget decisions, who designs the budgets, how the various spending allocations will happen, who decides who gets, which agency gets what. It's either sort of the French treasury saying like, you get this and you get that, or it's sort of a Soviet legacy that says, let's all get together on Dutch and have a little laugh and chat about what we're going to do. Again, I don't need to be smart in questions, but this is also how Germany would do it. So.
I like that you lowered your voice.
Sorry?
I like that you lowered your voice when you were talking about it.
Given that this is all online and two things here, I shouldn't. I need to
Be cautious.
be cautious. Oh no, I'm not going to do that. Well, the Russians are everywhere. Anyway, we need to be mindful of those cultural issues. But the other part we need to be mindful of, remember how we started. We said, okay, well, here's sort of what we think the government should do. These are sort of the overarching goals of goods and services that the government should provide. National security, domestic security, and so on. We then have a budget that is driven by how many resources we have and how certain our environment is. Decided by our historical legacies. We're an Iberian system, a French system, a Soviet system, British or UK system, a US system. And we then, after all of this is together, we decide on a revenue budget in a poor country with a certain environment. We do it through, let's say, GCPA, poor country. I don't know whether we have a certain environment, but it's sort of a central government that does it, and there's a treasury that says this way. And you have a budget. Ooh, you passed it. It made it. And it's only the first. That budget, especially sort of a revenue budget, will not meet all the aspirations, hopes, and desires of the citizen. It will meet some of them. It will keep a lot of people unhappy. Right? Typically, people are unhappy because you don't understand resources are constrained, and that requires state budgets. Now you have your budget. Now, how do you make sure that you actually implement that budget? It's now becomes sort of a fight over the various issues. You have a revenue cluster, meaning this is sort of Rubin's model, right? There are sort of interest groups. It can be large, it can be small, it can be large coalitions, it can be just a few lobbyists that will act on particular issue areas that affect budget implementation. You could have a budget that the politicians pass that said, we're going to raise taxes on wine producers. All of a sudden, you have everybody, the wine store owner, the liquor store owner, the restaurant owner, the wine grower in your country, the wine importer, saying like, let's all go down to Parliament and lobby against that. When it comes to lobbying, you've got to remember, when you have something as specific as we're going to tax wine, tobacco, pollution in Beijing, something as specific as that, you have very determined special interest groups fighting against it. Wow. They're small, but they energize and they can muster all of their voices and resources to fight against that proposal. On the other side is sort of the average citizen of Beijing. Goes to work in the morning after feeding their children, after clothing their children, going to school, going to work, worrying about their job, coffee, maybe having a mask or around something like that, they're going home, turning off the light, going, but coughing 5 minutes. That's the time that the average citizen has to dedicate to pollution, maybe half an hour. There is no room for the average citizen to build a coalition that is effectively fighting for better pollution control. Right? The issue when it comes to specific proposals is that you have a very determined group that can spend a lot of resources and a lot of their time fighting a proposal against a large group that can dedicate only very small time and resources to a particular fight. And in that world, the larger group is determined to lose. This is why often you want to have things like the Paris Climate Accord or something like that, something large and binding that is very hard for individual groups to lobby against, because there's nothing specific in there that says, and we're going to ban VW diesel with a 5-liter engines or whatever in Beijing. It only says we're going to have these overarching controls on emissions by 2025. It is then up to individual governments to figure out through regulation, spending, tax incentives to reach that goal. And that's sort of when the fight's happen. And again, on the revenue side, I'm going to give you a US example. There's 2 proposals to control revenue in the United States related to tax deductions. So what we have in the United States, which I'm sure is the same in other countries, to figure out how much taxes you owe, and then there's certain things you can deduct, business expenses or charitable giving. Give to my church, I deduct that from the taxes I owe. I don't know what the equivalent would be each month. I assume you owe some taxes, and there's some things you can do to reduce your taxes. Now, there was a proposal from, like, here's an example that will never fly. If you said, we're going to reduce the amount that Americans can deduct for their taxes to give to their church, this country would go down. Because it's very specific, the churches here are very powerful lobby. On the other hand, if you said, you know what, we're not going to tell you which deductions we're going to limit, we're just going to say you cannot deduct more than 25% of your income for any reason, be that for retirement, for healthcare, for charitable giving, it's 25%. You decide how you're going to spend those 25% of your income for deductions. And all of a sudden, you have weaken the lobbyists because they don't know which part will be cut, which part will be affected. That's a way to sort of, this is sort of revenue. You, like on the revenue side, right? Right now there's a conversation in the United States whether we're going to have tax reform or whether we're going to have tax cuts. Tax reform, if we had actually a real conversation about tax reform, meaning some taxes will go up, some will go down. If the more specific you are about those proposals, especially those proposals where taxes will go up, the more aggressive, like the clearer target you give to the lobbyists, the better. That's the revenue cluster. The budget process cluster. Who actually has a say in the budget? Everybody wants to have a say, right? At the local level, Massachusetts is a prime example for a lot of participatory democracy. We have town meetings. Where do you guys live? You live all in Boston? So that's Boston. Everybody lives in Boston? Brookline? Well, Brookline is a city, right? All right. You all live in Boston? Quincy?
Yeah.
Quincy is a city.
Yes.
I live in Beverly, so it's also a city. All right. Massachusetts has cities and towns. The towns have town meetings. They don't have a mayor. Town meetings that hire town manager. Roughly speaking. We have 350 cities and towns. Everybody does their own thing to some. But there is a lot of input and conversations about shaping the finance committee decides where the money comes from. The school committee decides, citizens, volunteer citizens, decide then how much money to spend for a new gym versus hiring teachers versus special ed on the school committee, right? A lot of this is then decided at the local level. Now, take that in France. It's like the federal government, the central government, right? It's not a federation. It says this department gets that much, and this department gets that much. Everybody spends this much in healthcare, then we're just going to send you a check, and you send us the revenues. Right? There is much less participation, and this is sort of the conversation that we've seen over in many countries over the last 20 years. Is this conversation about evolution, decentralization of this decision-making process to give citizens a greater voice, but also to some degree educating citizens about the trade-offs that are necessary when it comes to budget. We can't have everything. We don't have the resources. The expenditure cluster. How do we actually spend the money, right? Saying we're going to spend this much money on a road. Let's say we're Roxbury or Boston, and we're going to spend $10 million on a road. You're not actually going to hire, you don't have the workers in Roxbury, right, as the government of Boston. You contract that out. And then becomes the technical question of how do you best select the contractor? How do you make sure you don't run into a big problem? I mean, China has a lot of mega projects, like the maglev train, the Shanghai region, the elevated high-speed train from the city to the airport.
Too many cities.
The high-speed train, the magnetic,
Most of the big cities.
the magnetic leverage, they all have it. It's a German technology. Germany didn't want it. I'm glad you guys took it. It's a very cool technology. They're very fast, right?
Yeah. From the city to the airport. And all 20 minutes.
No, like I've never been on. I mean, there is sort of a trial track in Hamburg and Berlin. It's a Siemens technology, and I think just in the Siemens built, probably a joint venture in UK, China has joint ventures or stuff like this, right? But you hire contracts, and so one of the questions, for instance, is how in China, right? Like for a country like Germany, for the US, where technology was developed in the first place. It's more about cost control. In a country like China, where the technology wasn't developed, you want to get someone a piece of the action. China is really good saying like, look, we have lots of cities where we want to build this. We're going to give you a check of several $1 billion. We're going to make you rich, but you're going to share the technology behind. Right? How do you, there is no incentive for the Chinese government to do it, because you would have to reinvent the wheel. You do this in aircraft, like China is a master of engaging, because you're a big country with deep pockets and you have ambitious goals when it comes to infrastructure. I'm not saying anything new, but China is known to engage in these joint ventures and technology sharing agreements. And countries go along, like the US or Germany, knowing that they're sharing vital technology that they invest a lot of money in, but they want the revenue net, right? There's a reason we want to do this. Everybody, at least in the short run, wins. In the end, so it comes back to home. Hurt us because, look, we did this with Japan. Right? The US shared readily technology with Germany and Japan after the war in the aircraft industry, largely because it was necessary to build up these energy. So this historical aside, it was necessary to share modern aerospace know-how after World War II as a defense mechanism. You couldn't fly a Boeing bomber back from Tokyo every time a red light was waiting. You needed aircraft mechanics in Frankfurt, you needed aircraft mechanics in Tokyo or Osaka who knew how to fix this. And so, in the end, the US was willing to share its cutting-edge technology, especially military technology, on its jet engines with its allies. The result was that Germany built an aircraft engine that has some good aircraft, especially jet engine manufacturers, and China does now, same reasons. And there was more on the commercial side, right? Not so much in the military technology, but you don't want to fly a big Boeing jet airplane back to Seattle every time it gets the sniffles. You want to fix it in Asia, and one of the biggest markets is China, so you train mechanics in China to fix it. But in the end, mechanics in China figure out how to build their own airplanes. Just like the Germans and the Japanese did before. That sort of technology sharing happens all the time, and you do this through the budget process. And you do it strategically. China was particularly strategic, but so was Germany, I think. This is why there is a German aerospace industry. We have Airbus, which is a real competitor now to Boeing. We have European Space Agency, which is a real competitor to NASA. Right? This is technology that essentially was shared with the Europeans as part of post-war regimes. Right? But those are expenditure decisions. How do you leverage the spending that you already allocated? So we're going to spend this much money on aerospace, on military hardware. We're going to spend it. But who do you spend it on? How do you sort of meet multiple goals? The other goal, we already talked about, national security is an agreed upon goal. But another goal is regional equality. How do you make sure you have good jobs in underdeveloped areas of your country? This is why we build helicopters in Alabama. Or in Kansas City, we shift, right, military hardware installations towards underdeveloped areas to boost. Not everything can be made in the middle of Arkansas, but some hardware can. So you give it to areas. So you basically, in the expenditure decisions, in this expenditure plus, where and how you spend that money is decided by lobby, but also by multiple countries. You already decided you're going to spend money on the military hardware. Now is the question of how do you get the hardware that you need? How is there any way you can sort of build other meet other social economic goals, like regional economic development, redistribution of income to poorer areas? How can we rebuild a manufacturing base where, for instance, the private sector has left, let's say, car manufacturers have left the area, which is crazy. And I'm sure this is sort of stuff that China does too, that it thinks about sort of where can we shift some of the manufacturing. We know, I mean, a lot of it is government enterprise. Where can we move government enterprises where economic development needs to hit? We know we're going to build this stuff. We're going to build aircraft. We're going to build rail cars. We're going to build, we're already allocated the money. We're going to build bridges. We're going to build parts of roads and stuff. Transportation costs are minimal in a time when you're building high-speed rail and highways and everything. So putting it somewhere in the outskirts of your country where people need it is then sort of trying to meet more than one goal, namely national defense or infrastructure and greater equality across regions. That's expanding. Okay? And then the balance cluster. Do we need to balance the budget, either for political reasons or for economic reasons? For economic reasons, most states, smaller countries, cities need to balance their budgets, regardless of what the law says. You can't really go into deficits, at least for your operation budget, meaning sort of your day-to-day operations. You can borrow money to build a road within limits, but the IMF or the World Bank will help you with something like a bigger infrastructure project if you can't access capital. So it's an often economic necessity. The United States is sort of an outlier. We can do whatever we want. China and Japan will finance whatever crazy ideas we have, at least for the time. Okay? And then there's the politics. The group of people who will then worry about how do we sell the budget and the implementation of the budget. That's typically administration and Congress. And then there's the other group who, how do we make the people who made a budget we disagree with look their worst? Right? And we're going to see a lot of this happen. The next discussion, I think the discussion over healthcare review is done in the United States, but the United States is going to be sort of, because we happen to live here for the time being, and I assume you read newspapers and Twitter and Facebook and all of that stuff, and so some of these news should start reading some of the local newspapers, the Washington Post, New York Times, Twitter. It's always, I find, a good resource, The Economist. We're going to have a massive, massive national discussion over tax cuts in the coming months. You're going to already see Republicans in Congress and the administration trying to paint those tax cuts in the best possible light. You're going to see people opposing those tax cuts. There's a full disclosure, I oppose them, making them look in the worst place. That's the politics. Here in the United States, that happens both through the official Congress, but it also happens through the think tanks and newspapers and the blogs and a lot of this other stuff that happens. So, all right. Those are the things we. How much time do we have? Are we out? Sure. It's 8 already? Exactly? All right. We'll fix it up, but we got pretty much through most of this that I wanted to get through. What we're going to do is we're going to finish out sort of budget implementation, some of the things that are sort of practical aspects, and then I'm going to go quickly over some basic concepts that you can find in some discussions. This is all from this book. So, and then we're going to go and start with the China presentation next week.
We're gonna go to presentation first.
Yeah, I'll say a few words and then it's to you. Do you want me to talk? Do you want to go later in the evening?
That will make a difference. But yeah, I would rather do it later.
You want to do it later? Then I'll talk about China first and then.
I know that, but.
If you have any questions about the presentation, I appreciate you going first. Shoot me an email.
Yeah.
Okay. And I'll post the updated syllabus is should be already on Blackboard, and I will post updated presentation schedule and my class notes. Probably not going to get to it tonight. I don't have internet access usually on the train. Well,
On that note of the presentation, Miguel did get back to me and I've CC'd you in the emails, but she didn't agree to trade. So.
okay. Awesome. All right. And yeah, if you have any questions, so next week when we talk about Ghana, we're going to talk largely about taxes. What is the tax base? I want to refine a little bit of the conversation